Well, when I was a teenager, I graduated high school at 17, and I was such a good kid. I worked for years, saved all my own money to go to college for a year, and then I decided I wanted to go to Australia because I heard it was hot there when it was cold here. So that sounded awesome. So I took off, and I wanted to save money, and I was determined to go traveling for at least a year and take off. I had this one friend who kind of got me into it, kind of corrupted me. But anyway, I'll get back to that story. But the snow this morning reminded me of that. Like, why are we here in Canada again? No, I love Canada. I really do. But today I'm going to look at Luke chapter 15, which was just read. And it's the story, it's commonly known as the prodigal son. I'm not sure that's its real title. Jesus starts out the story saying there was once a man with two sons. So it's really a story about two sons, not just the prodigal, but the prodigal is kind of the famous one. And so I'm going to talk about a few different prodigal sons. I called this sermon, I think, 3 different prodigal sons and their fathers. And so one of them, of course, is going to be Jesus' story of the prodigal son and the elder brother. But also, I think that even when Jesus tells the story, he has in mind an Old Testament story as well. Of course, I'm an Old Testament professor. I see the Old Testament in everything I read in the New Testament. But I really do think that Jesus had in mind the story of Jacob and Esau. I was almost going to get them to read Jacob and Esau's story, but it's really long, so we didn't read it this morning. I hope you're familiar with it. If not, check it out in Genesis. It's a fantastic story, the story of Jacob and Esau. And also, I'm going to think back and talk a little bit about my travel days and how I kind of became a prodigal son as well back in the day. So in Jesus' parable, you have 3 different characters, and when you have different characters in a story, you have different perspectives. You could say 3 different truths, 3 truths, 3 perspectives. You have the prodigal son, how he viewed himself and his life. You have the father's perspective and the elder brother's perspective. And so it's interesting to look at the different ways, their take on the story. So I'm going to think about that as we look at the story, and also think about Jacob and Esau and my own dad. And me being the prodigal. So the story starts out in Luke 15:12. The son says, "Father, give me my share of the property, and that will belong to me." So he's basically asking for his inheritance before his father dies. This is outrageous. Can you believe it? How could you do such a thing? It's kind of shocking. It shows disrespect for the father. He wants his inheritance early. Well, in the Old Testament, the younger son of that story is Jacob, Esau being the older brother. And he kind of has similar interests. In the Old Testament story, Jacob wants to get the inheritance. He wants to get the blessing and the birthright. He goes out about some tricky ways to do it. I don't have time to go over the whole story, but he kind of tricks his older brother out of the birthright through giving him some red pottage, whatever that is. His brother comes in and he's starving. He says, "Hey, I'll feed you if you give me your birthright." And he's like, "Sure, go ahead." Trades it off. Probably because he knows that he's still going to get that blessing from his father. But then Jacob, with his mommy, he's kind of a mommy's boy, if you didn't know that, Jacob. And he gets his mommy on his side, and he finds out a way of tricking his father into giving him the blessing too. If you've never read this story, it's kind of outrageous. His brother is hairy. Esau is the older, tough hunter guy, and he's all hairy. And Jacob is the smooth-skinned guy who lives in tents. He's kind of the mama's boy. And he goes and he tricks his dad into getting the blessing. When his dad is almost blind and he's old and he's going to bless his son, he puts goat's hair on him, dresses up like Esau, and goes in and tricks his dad into giving him the blessing. It's kind of an outrageous story. You got to read it if you haven't read it lately. It's even great as he walks in, like Isaac's like, "It kind of feels like Esau, but it sounds like Jacob. Is this really you, Esau?" Like there's all this kind of drama in there. You have to check it out. So anyway, I don't have time to get into it all. But so Jacob kind of is after the blessing early too. Well, my story. Back when I went to college for 1 year, and then I decided I wanted to travel. And I knew I had to get some money together to travel, so I got a job when I came home from college in the summer, started saving money. And then when my dad learned of my plans to travel instead of go back to school, all of a sudden he demanded I pay rent. No one went, what? terrible. How can my dad be like that, right? Well, that's what I felt like. I'm like, what? How can you charge me rent? I live here. Not only that, my older brother, when he used to come home from college and work in the summer, he never ever had to pay rent. Of course, in my dad's perspective, it was, well, he's saving for college, so we're not going to charge him rent. So I was ticked. I was really mad at my dad and kind of gave him the cold shoulder for a while, and I was pretty upset. So we got 3 stories here of younger brothers who kind of make unreasonable requests of their fathers. And there's very self-interested children. Me especially, maybe. So what about the fathers in these 3 stories? So the fathers. In Jesus' parable, the father, wait for it if you didn't listen to the reading, he agrees to the son's demands. That's crazy. What kind of a father would do that? Right? The son wants his inheritance before he dies, and he gives it to him. Now, in this parable, the father is kind of like God, if you didn't really get it. That's where it's kind of going. Does this sound like God? Would God do something like this? Does God act that way in your life? In my life? Well, at first it seems outrageous, but when you start thinking about what God is like, maybe. Actually, our response to that question might lead us to realize who we identify with better in the story, the baby brother or the older brother. Well, in the Old Testament story, the father is Isaac, and he wasn't exactly the same disposition as the father in the parable. So Isaac actually sets out to only bless his older son. Maybe you're so used to the story you never thought about it, but why is he only blessing the older son? In other Old Testament stories, a father will bless all his children. And Jacob, interestingly, at the end of Genesis, says blessings for all his kids. Why is he only going to bless the older son? And how much older is Esau than Jacob? Do you know the story? They're twins. They're twins. Not only that, they must have gone birth right after each other. Jacob is grasping Esau's heel when he comes out. So, they're the same age exactly, right? But he's the older. He's getting the only blessing. That's kind of interesting. So there's a contrast, I think, between the father figures in Isaac and the father in the parable. Luke 15:13-16 says, a few days later, the son gathers all that he has and goes to a distant country. Well, this kind of reminds me of my story. So back to my story where my dad wanted me to pay rent, unreasonably so, right? But I got my mom on my side because my mom's the softie in the family, as my wife will attest. And eventually she pressured dad into letting me have free rent. It's ridiculous. And then, so I worked for 6 months, saved money, ate all my mom and dad's food, and stayed for free. And then I took everything I had and went traveling. So kind of similar to the prodigal son in that respect. But in Luke 15, it says, he squanders all his property in dissolute living. It's a little ambiguous exactly how he spent it all, but when he had spent everything, a famine takes on the land throughout the whole country, and he is in need. So what's he do? What's a good Jewish boy going to do? He's going to go feed the pigs. Well, that is revolting for me, not being a farm boy. My wife grew up on a farm, and we visited a farm not that long ago, and I was walking around going, oh, this is so gross in the barn, and she's just like, man, you're such a city boy. But my shoes stunk like farm for 2 weeks after. Anyway, enough about that and my prissy ways. But here, this Jewish boy has to go feed pigs. Now, pigs are unclean. Jews did not eat pigs. This is like dropping to the very low rung of the employment totem pole. So he has to feed these unclean pigs. It's not looking very good for the prodigal son at this point. In the Old Testament parallel, after Jacob successfully tricks his dad, gets the blessing after already taking the birthright, he actually has to pack up his inheritance and take off and run for his life. He's afraid his older brother Esau is going to kill him. So he basically severs all ties with his family. Even though he's the mama's boy, he never sees his mom again, takes off, and he ends up sleeping out in the field with a stone for a pillow. It's not looking that good for Jacob at that point either. Well, in my story, like I said, I used all my free rent and everything, took off, traveled, spent a year in Australia working on nothing but my tan, chasing waves and women, and all this kind of dissolute living. Well, not really, very tame compared to, but anyway. But I blew all my money. And I got broke pretty quickly, but then the tax return time came around, and my dad graciously filed my taxes and sent me my tax return too, so I could keep on spending my money. And when I totally ran completely out of money, I ended up on my way home, and I got myself into a little trouble. I was backpacking in Malaysia at the time. So I spent some time in Australia, went to Singapore and Malaysia, and it was actually my second last day before a flight out from Singapore, third last, I can't remember. This was back in 91. For those of you born in the 2000s, 91 is what we used to say for 1991, because 19 was what we had called all the years for 100 years. Anyway, we won't worry about it. So I was in Malaysia, and I was walking around this mall actually in Penang, and I ran into this friendly Malaysian guy named Johnny, and he invited me over to his house. I'm like, hey, this guy's so nice, I'll go over to his house. I know, I was stupid. But so I went over to this guy's house, and he starts telling me that he's a dealer at a casino, a professional dealer. And I was interested. Oh, that sounds cool. And he said, here, let me show you how we cheat at cards at the casino. And I'm like, oh, that sounds cool. Sure, show me. So he got out some cards, and he taught me how to read his signals, and so how we could cheat at cards and all this stuff. And I thought this was good fun. Thought it was totally safe. And then he says, hey, we're having a private game here tonight. Do you want to play? And you can read my signal. I'm like, no, I don't have any money. I said, I can't play. And he's like, well, I'll put in the money for you. You just play. I said, okay, why not? Sure, that sounds like fun. Stupid kid. But anyway, so I did that. And this guy shows up with like a briefcase of money, and they set it all up, and there's a dealer and this, and then we're playing. And I'm just doing awesome. I am just killing it. I'm $10,000 up. And I am excited. This is lots of fun. But then as it kept going, in order to keep playing, I had to show more money, of course. And I'm like, oh, I don't have any money. And then my host, Johnny, kind of grabs my passport and my wallet and everything that I had. And he said, oh, look, you got credit cards right here. We can go get some money and you can keep playing. And I was like, no, I don't have any money. And so they put a pause on the game. And they took my backpack and all my stuff away. And he says, we need to go and you need to buy diamonds with your credit card, or we're going to get into a lot of trouble here because they put up all this money and you didn't put up money. These guys will kill us. So I was scared. They told me that they would kill me. And so I was pretty freaked out. And so I'm like, look, I know my credit card has a $500 limit. And the only reason I have a credit card is my dad gave me a cosign for the credit card. It has a $500 limit. We can't go and buy money. He says, we need $5,000 in diamonds. I'm like, okay, we can go, but I don't have any money. So they took all my stuff except for my wallet, and we went to the diamond shop, and I'm like, I'm telling you, it's not going to work. Credit card goes through, $5,000 in diamonds, right? And I'm like, oh, I'm in so much trouble. And I was pretty freaked out. So we went back, but at the same time, I'm like, well, I guess we should win because they're cheating. They're giving me what card to take and what card not to take. And of course, when I come back, I lose the game. It was probably a bit of a setup. But I was pretty freaked out. I just lost $5,000. And it wasn't mine. It was my dad's money because it was my dad's credit card, pretty much. So I was freaked out, scared. They made threats on my life, and they said, we're going to get into big trouble. And I didn't know what to do. So their solution was, they said, well, we're having a game in Singapore tomorrow night. You go to Singapore, you meet us at this hotel, we'll play again, we'll win your money back. And I was so freaked out, I'm like, okay, I guess that's what I got to do. I don't want to bankrupt my dad. I really thought that $5,000 would put my dad in the poorhouse and we'd lose everything. I had no idea what money was, the value of money at the time. So I was pretty freaked out. And eventually I had to call Dad. And I really didn't want to call Dad. I was on the other side of the world, a scared little kid. Well, in Luke 15:17, the prodigal, it says, when he comes to himself, he came to himself. I just love these old pictures of myself back when I had more hair. After hitting rock bottom, the prodigal finally has an intelligent thought. He's like, you know, the slaves in my dad's house have it better than me. Here I am feeding disgusting pigs. I actually am so hungry I want to eat the pigs' food. He says, I got to go and call my dad too. I got to go back. Being a slave at my dad's house would be way better. Sometimes it takes a crisis situation to kind of make you come to your senses. So when I was finished that card game and I was freaked out, lost this money, didn't know what to do, panicking, the guy finally gives me my passport back because they had taken my passport, gave me my backpack, and they drove me to the top of this building, and we sat in this parking lot and waited, and then until this limo showed up. And so this limo shows up, and this big heavy guy with jewelry all over him gets out. I felt like I was in the middle of a movie or something. And then Johnny, my friend, talked with the guy in some other language for a long time. And then this guy pulled out this big wad of money, and they called a cab. And when the cab driver came, he just gave him like tons and tons of bills. I don't know, it was like Malaysian cash. I don't know how much it came to. But it was a lot of money, so that they would drive me from Penang to Singapore so I could play the next game. That's like an 8-hour drive or something in a cab. Who would take a cab for that long? Anyway, so I was pretty freaked out, and I thought these guys were like mafia or something. I don't know what it was, but it gives them all this money, and this is what I'm doing. I get in this cab, and they're driving me to Singapore, and I'm pretty freaked out. But my plan was, I got to go and win Dad's money back. I'm going to go to the casino and play this game, and hopefully we'll win Dad's money back. I was really scared. But eventually, before I did it, because I was scared they were going to kill me or something, I finally did break down and call Dad. Of course, there was no cell phones back then. There was a time before cell phones, for me anyway. And I had to use a pay phone, and I called Dad, and I was sure Dad was going to say, "You better go to the casino, you better win that money back." That's how naive I was. So the perspective, that's my perspective. The perspective of the prodigal son in the story. The biggest tragedy, I think, of the prodigal's life was he didn't really know his dad very well. He didn't understand his dad loved him so much, and that what he had at home was better than he could find out on his own. What was available to him at home was more than all the pleasure and money in the world. And you see this from what the prodigal's confession. He kind of comes up, "This is what I'm going to say to my dad." He says, "I'm no longer worthy to be your son. I'm no longer worthy to be your son." This is kind of the story as the prodigal sees it. This is his perspective. He's not worthy. He can no longer be his father's son because of what he did. In the Old Testament parallel, it's interesting that Jacob, when Jacob is finally going to return home to Israel, he composes a speech too, but he's not afraid of what his father is going to say. He's afraid of his older brother Esau, who he ripped off, right? And he actually composes a speech too. I don't think I have it on there, but if you look up Genesis 32, 4 and 5, this is what Jacob says. "Say to my lord Esau," so he calls him Lord. He says, "Thus says your servant Jacob, I've lived with Laban as an alien and stayed till now. But I have oxen, flocks, slaves. I've sent them to tell my lord Esau in order I could find favor in your sight." So it's kind of similar to the prodigals in that he's saying, "I'm your servant, I'm your slave." And he's trying to give him a gift so that he'll forgive him or not kill him at least or something like that, right? So it's kind of similar. So in Genesis 32:8, we see that Jacob is actually freaked out. He thinks Esau is not only going to kill him, but his family. And we're going to see he was actually dead wrong about what Esau was going to do, what Esau would be like. If you hadn't read the story yet, it's such a fantastic ending to that. But similar to the prodigal and Jacob, who thought that Esau was going to be mad at him, I thought that my dad was going to be pretty ticked and would just tell me to go play that game, get me that money back, and call me back or something like that, right? But of course, I didn't understand the Father's love. I didn't understand that he would not want me to go to meet some criminals or put myself in danger. He loved me more than the money. So Luke 15:20. The prodigal sets off. He goes to his father. When he was still a long way off, his father sees him. His father saw him. So here we get the father's perspective on the whole thing. The father's reaction is probably not the reaction the hearers of this story would have imagined. We're so used to it. We're used to the father doing what he does. But back in that environment, actually, if you look in the Old Testament, in Deuteronomy 21, it talks about stoning a rebellious child, right? Well, that's a little different than what the father does here. But he at least deserved a good beating for all that he had done and shamed his father. But no, the father totally defies cultural expectations. We see that he's actually been looking for his son every day on the horizon. That's at least the picture you get. He sees him a long way off. Excuse me. And he can hardly wait, and he runs out to embrace him, right? Well, when I called my dad from Singapore, he, of course, said, don't go to the hotel. And he just said, go to the police. Or he said, do you know someone in Singapore? Go see them, get some help, and go to the airport. So I went to the police, and I remember when I met with the police, I had a friend in Singapore, so I went to her house, and we went to the police, and then I told them my story. And at the end of it, they said, yeah, a lot of people get ripped off around here, a lot of tourists with these kinds of things. Do you want us to file a report for you? And I was like, oh, no, it's okay, don't worry about it. And then when we called Visa, when I got home, they said, well, if you filed a report, we'll forgive the whole debt. And I didn't file the report. But anyway, doesn't matter. Just remember that now. But to my dad, of course, what was more important than his son? I couldn't imagine. I hope my son never does what I did. But anyway, nothing would be more important than the safety of my son. Bring my son home. The prodigal believed he couldn't be his son anymore after what he did. He thought that his dad would be angry. But the father instead puts the best robe on his son, gives him a ring. He gives him an honored status. The father's perspective completely disagrees with what the son thought, the son's perspective. The prodigal thought he was unworthy. His father's perspective is all about redemption. My son is back. This deserves a party. My son is home again. So the prodigal has to decide. He gets back. He has to decide if he's going to trust his dad. Is he going to believe his dad's version of the story or his own? Right? Will he always live kind of looking over his shoulder or suspecting his dad's going to, harbor a grudge? What's going to happen? Is he going to trust his father's perspective? Well, there's one more perspective in the story. The older brother, right? The elder brother. And he's the second son. He's the good kid, right? He's the good son. He didn't abandon the family and go blow his money or demand his inheritance early. He's the good son. He's the responsible one. He's worked hard for the family. The older brother has a different perspective on this whole version and a different version of the story. In Luke 15, he says, listen, all these years I've been working like a slave around here, Dad. That's what he says, like a slave. That's his perspective. I never disobeyed your command, yet you haven't even given me a goat. You haven't given me a young goat so I could go party with my friends. Not even a goat. But when this son of yours, he says, your son comes back after he's devoured your property with prostitutes. I don't remember that being in the story anywhere. Did he read that into it? Did he assume, if I was going to go do that, that's what I would do? I don't know where he came up with that, but it doesn't say that in the story. He says, you have killed the fatted calf for him. You didn't even give me a goat. A goat doesn't have that much meat on it. If he was going to have a party, it'd kind of be a lame party with a goat, but anyway. But here he gets the fatted calf. Sorry, that's a terrible joke. And he says, of course, it's your son, not my brother. He's kind of disowning him there. All the bitterness of the years comes out in his statement there. Well, just like the younger brother, the elder brother didn't really seem to know his father very well. According to the older brother's perspective, he's been a slave. He's been slaving all these years. That's how he views his life in the father's house, working for no wages. His father is cheap. Didn't even give him the goat, right? You've been cheap with me, Dad. And his father is unfair. He's shown bias to the younger brother who's come back, and now there's this party. He thinks he's been screwed over, and he's furious about it. He thought, hey, I'm the one who deserved the party. I stayed here all these years. I was the faithful son. I worked. Not this bratty brother who stinks like pig poop. We don't like this guy. The elder brother didn't get it. It wasn't about who was good and who was bad. He totally didn't get it. His son was alive and he'd come back. This was reason for celebration. It wasn't because he deserved it. The party, of course, is like pumping in the background, and the elder son won't even come into the party, and he's so upset. He won't come in. Well, in the Old Testament, when Jacob is finally coming back, Esau of course, is the brother who didn't leave home, who didn't trick his parents into his inheritance. And he actually asked his dad for a blessing after the fact, after he lost it. In Genesis 27:38, Esau says to his father, he says, "Have you only got one blessing, Father? Bless me also, Father." And Esau lifts up his voice and he weeps. The poor guy, he was kind of screwed over. But throughout the Bible, Esau is viewed pretty negatively. He's the father of the Edomite people who are adversaries to the Israelites. And later, Edom kind of represents kind of this a sinner. And so it's kind of shocking. If Esau ever had a really good moment, it was when he finally meets Jacob after all those years. In Genesis 33, what does he do when he shows up? Well, it says Esau runs to meet Jacob. He embraces him. He falls on his neck. He kisses him, and they weep. Wow. He's a pretty gracious guy after all that happened. He's just excited to see his brother, and he hugs him. He kisses him. Actually, come to think of it, it uses the same language the father in the parable does to the prodigal. In Luke 15, it says, he arose, came to his father. When he was a great way off, his father saw him, had compassion. He ran, he fell on his neck, and he kissed him. Did the same things Esau did. Actually, I think Jesus is kind of alluding to the story there. And so this elder brother is so ticked at the younger son. Well, look at wicked Esau in the Old Testament. Even he was gracious and embraced the prodigal son. So I think it makes the elder brother look even worse. Even wicked Esau was more gracious than this. And the elder brother, Esau, is actually gracious. When Jacob shows up and they meet, Jacob's trying to give him gifts and trying to kind of win him over. He doesn't really trust him. And in Genesis 33:9, Esau says, "Hey, keep your stuff." He says, "I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." He's an incredibly gracious guy at that point. So we've had all these different perspectives, the prodigal son, the elder brother. How about the father's perspective? His version of the story is, to the elder brother, he says, "Son, you've always been with me, and everything I have is yours." So the older brother hasn't been a slave. The older brother actually gets a double portion. Back in that culture, the older brother gets twice as much as the other siblings. There's two siblings. That means he's getting 2/3 of the property. That means what the father says here is true. Everything I have is yours. It's all yours. He hasn't been slaving away to earn it. It's already his. That's a completely different view. The father hasn't been cheap with him. If the elder brother owns everything, it includes fatted calves, I assume, not just the goats. But the father retells the story here, just like he did with the prodigal. But the father isn't unfair. He is gracious. He's generous. And grace and generosity aren't fair. They're not fair. So the prodigal has come home. He's been shown this fantastic grace and generosity. And now the elder brother has to learn to deal with it. With the prodigal, the father says he's his son. And with the elder, he says, "You are my son. Everything I have is yours. You've always been with me. All I have is yours." So now the elder brother, just like the prodigal, has to figure out if he's going to trust the father. Is he going to trust the father's version of events here? Is he going to go join the party or not? Who will he trust? Who will he believe? The older brother is right at the party but won't go in, right? Because he doesn't trust the father. So one more perspective. Your perspective. I don't mean you particularly. I mean our perspective. This parable, of course, speaks to all of us, right? Our version of our story, who we've done, or maybe what we haven't done, or who we are, who we aren't. Sometimes we get haunted by our past. When I wrote this sermon, it was amazing actually how I was so ashamed of these events that I wouldn't even talk about it. My wife will remember. For years, I didn't want to tell anyone this story because I was so ashamed of everything that happened. And even when I was writing this sermon, I could kind of feel the shame building up again, even though this was so long ago. Sometimes we cling to shame and guilt because even if they're causing us, ruining our lives, causing us pain and agony. We hold on to this guilt kind of like the prodigal does, right? And we think we're not good enough. If that is you, and I don't know most of you very well, if that is you, this parable is saying, come home. There's grace, there's forgiveness. There's no need to live with shame and guilt. But then others of us, perhaps, we're more like the older brother. Maybe we've been working hard for God for years, or we feel like we've been faithful and haven't gotten our goat. We might have a skewed idea of God. We could become bitter after serving all these years. I worked ceaselessly for the kingdom. Why is this not working out? What do I have to show for it? Where's my goat? Whatever your version of events, our perspective, God's perspective is the truth. Okay? God's perspective is the truth. But we need to live in that reality. God's perspective is you are his children, and everything he has is yours. Come home. He has done everything for you. But we need to live in that. We need to trust the gospel, the good news. A distorted view of the Father leads to kind of messed up perspectives in life. What we believe matters. Our theology matters. What is God like? This will make a change in your life. Can we trust God's perspective? Or are we going to cling to our own perspective, our own guilt, or our own pride, whatever it might be? The prodigal thought he didn't deserve to be a son. The older brother thought he deserved it, and he had been slaving for it. Well, Titus 3:5, and this is the last scripture we'll look at here. Titus 3:5 says that God saved us, not because of any works of righteousness that we have done, but according to his mercy. And that is the good news. The good news is God saves us, not because we are worthy, but because he is worthy, because of what he did for us. Interesting, the parable ends, and it never tells us what the older brother's response is. You ever notice that? The final response of the older brother is never stated. So it kind of leaves it open, maybe for us to respond. How are we going to respond to God's story, to the Father's story? Who are we going to trust? Whose perspective are we going to live our life from? I'm just going to pray to close. God, thanks for your amazing grace and this fantastic story, God. Lord, I pray we would all live from your perspective, that we would live in light of your salvation, your grace, and that regardless of who we are or what we've done, we can trust in you and what you've done for us. And I pray, God, that you would lead us all to trust in you and make all the difference in our lives. In Jesus' name, I pray. Amen.